Thank everybody for coming to First Tuesday. This is the first Tuesday to Metro Archives for March. We're going to have Dr. Shannon Hodge talk to us about the archaeological dig at Grassmere. It's really going to be fascinating. I've been looking forward to this one for quite some time, so I appreciate you being here for it. In April, we'll have Gene Roseman will come and talk about Down Ashore, and then in May, we'll have Terry Coates. He will come and talk about Nashville railroads. So today, though, we have Dr. Hodge. I want to appreciate you coming, and without anything else, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hodge.
All right, Thank you. Thank you. Well, and I'd like to say I appreciate you having me here today. This is, it's always fun to have the chance to get out and talk about the fun work I've been doing. And I was just saying that I love having a microphone because then I can wander. I was just saying that, you know, I get up every morning and I feel lucky to do what it is that I do for a living, just because it's so gratifying and so interesting to be able to really bring new information out. And it's been particularly gratifying for this project in that the folks that I was working with represent an underrepresented segment of American and of Nashville history. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the Nashville Zoo Cemetery Project. As you know, I think that in the winter of 2014, there were excavations of an unmarked historic cemetery right at the entrance kiosk of the Nashville Zoo. And I was asked to take a look at the human skeletal remains that came from this cemetery and see if I could tell some more about who these folks were and what went on in their lives. I am not the archaeologist who dug up these remains. I can answer some questions about that, and I can, of course, always refer you to my colleagues who did the actual digging. My name is Shannon Hodge. I'm an archaeologist at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm actually what's called a bioarchaeologist, which means that human skeletal remains are my specialization within archaeology. And so looking at these remains is part of what I love to do the most. I want to give you a caveat and let you know that this presentation does include images of human skeletal remains, and that these are the remains of slaves associated with the Grassmere Historic Farm. And I want to emphasize that I don't take it lightly to show these images of these folks that we as archaeologists, particularly when we dig up a grave, we know that we're the first people to lay eyes on these folks since their loved ones put them in the ground and mourned over them. In this particular case, this is also a segment of the population that was exploited in life. And so I want to make it clear that that the intent here is not to exploit these folks in their death as well. So up until early 2014, when I thought about the Nashville Zoo, I thought about elephants and tigers and the monkey islands that my kids like to go to, and ghouls at Grassmere, the Halloween celebration at the zoo. And this photograph was taken, as you can see, in October of 2013, and the two munchkins on the left are mine. That would be Supergirl and I think a ninja, and a couple of cousins. And we were heading out to do our trick-or-treating at Ghouls at Grassmere, and notice the Nashville Zoo sign there in the background and that thicket of bamboo there. Little did we know at the time that we were taking this photograph that in that thicket of bamboo, directly behind where the kids are standing, would be a historic cemetery, that's the location of the cemetery. Give you a little background on this. Grassmere Historic Farm has an interesting historical trajectory in that it's really only been owned by two families. That in 1786, it was established as a Revolutionary War grant to William Simpson, and in 1810, Simpson's sons sold the property to Michael and Elizabeth Dunn. So the Dunn family are the first owners of this property, and in the following year, they began construction of the core of what is now the Croft House at Grassmere Historic Farm. In 1846, the property passes to Dunn's daughter and her husband, who was a Shute. So we're moving into the Shute family, Shute Lane, etc. And in 1850, the slave census lists 9 slaves. Before emancipation, enslaved African Americans were not listed in census records as individual people. They were simply enumerated and counted. So we have 9 slaves in 1850, passes on to the next generation. By 1860, we've got 32 slaves. When we look at the census records across the holdings of this property, there's an average of 30 some odd slaves fairly consistently throughout time until the point of emancipation. This is Elise and Margaret Croft. They're the granddaughters of the last of the Shute family. And they had a wonderful, colorful life that I encourage you to go visit the Grassmere Historic Farm at the zoo and let the docents there tell you the story of the Croft Sisters, because it's really, they spent a lot of their childhood in Cuba. Their dad had a bit of a run-in with Castro, etc. So it's very interesting. They were the last private owners of Grassmere, and as part of their estate planning, they left the property, the house and the entire property that the zoo is on, to the Nashville Wildlife Park, no, to the Children's Museum. Ultimately, it was a wildlife park and then eventually became the zoo. As part of that transition from 1985, when the property passes into public hands, and 1998, when the zoo takes over, there was actually a couple of archaeological surveys that were done. And in 1989, this historic cemetery was discovered. Nobody knew it was there. It appears nowhere in any of the records, historic records, diaries, maps, nothing. So the question was, when this cemetery was to be excavated, when it was to be exhumed, was who's buried in that cemetery? Well, the question that became of greatest interest was this white family cemetery from some, residents that nobody knew anything about, or is this in fact the slave cemetery associated with the historic farm? And there were some clues that led to that idea being put forward. First of all, we know where the Dunn-Shute-Croft family cemetery is. This is the map of the property from the 1989 archaeological report. And you see here, this is the Croft House associated with the historic farm. And this is the family cemetery. So we know where they're buried, out behind the main house, and it's a lovely little historic cemetery, and they've done a great job of leaving it in its 19th century sort of state. It's very pretty. So we know where the family cemetery was. So this is not the family cemetery. When the archaeologists were digging in this location before the cemetery was discovered, and in fact in excavations at the same time, There are historic structures here. We have evidence of nails, we have glass, we have artifacts, and a historic trash dump. So there's some sort of residence here. There's also a spring located very close here. There's one near the Croft house, and then there's another spring close to this location. We also have an unbroken family ownership of the property dating all the way back to 1810, from 1810 to 1985. So it's not as if there, some other residents might have sneaked in there for a while and established this cemetery. No white or free black tenants are known to have ever lived on the property, that it was the Dunn, Shute, Croft families and the slave community. We do know there were slaves on the property, and a slave cemetery has never been discovered. So again, logical that this would have been the slave cemetery. And the material culture is consistent with some African American burial traditions. In particular, we see these glass seed beads. They were found in the graves of 2 of the infants, young children. And they were arranged, they were near the sort of the collar of these children, as if they were decoration on a night dress or something like that. Blue glass beads figure prominently in African American mortuary customs historically, and in life ways, that blue is a very important color spiritually speaking. The question that led to the idea that maybe this wasn't the slave community is that these were, there was a good bit of investment in these graves, that every single one of these individuals was buried in a coffin. They're all hexagonal, traditional, the sort of, Count Dracula coffin, right? Which, in my experience in looking at slave cemeteries in Middle Tennessee, is not the most common form of burial. That typically they would have been buried in a shroud and simply put in a hole in the ground. That you see shroud pins where a long piece of cloth would have been wound around them and then pinned together. They were wearing their clothes. We have buttons. Both bone buttons and then later on some porcelain buttons that are a very good time marker of the date 1840, show up in some of the later graves. They were wearing shoes. That these items here are the yes, the eyelets for your shoes or for a pair of leather boots. So they went into the ground with their clothes and their shoes on, which would have been an unusual degree of sort of consumption for a slave burial. And so the question was out there. And so the Nashville Zoo asked the excavators, TRC Environmental, Dr. Larry McKee, who was formerly the lead archaeologist at the Hermitage. So he's very familiar with historic and plantation archaeology in Middle Tennessee. His firm was the one that did these excavations, and the Nashville Zoo went to them and said, what can we do about trying to find out who these folks were? And so he called me up and said, what can we do about trying to find out who these folks were? And they were thinking in terms of doing DNA studies. And I said, well, I can definitely help you out. I can't run the DNA myself, but I can take the samples and, send them off to the proper lab to have that done. I said, but why don't you let me look at the skeletons as well, because I think I can tell you some things about them. And so the agreement was made, and the skeletal remains were delivered to my lab. This is where they started out, though. This is the cemetery itself, and the sign that my kids were standing in front of is kind of over in here. That it was 20 grave shafts, laid out roughly in 2 rows, adults, children, men and women mixed together, looking very much like family plots. Just as we would expect. All of the individuals except one were in the typical configuration with the heads to the west and the feet to the east. And here's the excavation underway. This here in the background, sort of giving the tour there, is Tori Mason, who's the director of the Croft House and the Grassmere Historic Farm. And she's been very instrumental in putting this all together and getting this research done. So the remains came to MTSU, and some of my intrepid students helped me out. The remains were brought in block in the soil that they came in, and we essentially excavated them on our lab tables. They were the soil was a little smelly, and so we decided to do most of the processing out on our sort of back patio, so to speak, at our lab. Not having anything to do with human decomposition, but having to do with the soil was wet when they were dug up in the winter, and that the soil itself had started to get a little mildewy. So we got them in the spring. March of last year was much different from March of this year. And we got these in the spring and did our lab processing here, sorted them out, inventoried all of the individuals to find out who was there, age and sex and pathology, etc. And this is what we found: 20 graves with 9 adults and 11 infants or children. We have as close as you can get to a 50-50 ratio of adult males to adult females. And you also have roughly 50% infant and childhood mortality, which is not that far off the mark in terms of 19th century mid-continent populations, and particularly in an enslaved population. One of the things we do note about the adults is that they died pretty young, that there were 9 adults. All of them were less than age 50 when they died, and 7 of the 9 were less than age 40 when they died. This may have to do with some of the patterns of purchase and then the 1864 emancipation, that it may be sampling error in that the very oldest of the community may have been emancipated before they died and would have been included in this cemetery sample. So hard to say on that one. This is one of the adults. This is burial 18, who was an adult female, relatively young, somewhere between the age of 20 and 35. I said that we had, let me go back just a little bit. I said that we had 20 graves. We had, one of the graves was actually empty. It was a very small coffin-shaped soil stain, which we believe held an infant, and that the remains had completely decomposed. So where do we get then the extra individual to make up the 20? Well, come to find out, in our lab processing, we discovered that burial 18 was in fact pregnant at the time that she died, and that there were in fact fetal remains in her abdominal cavity, which is not something I've ever experienced before. And it was a little, it takes you aback. It's a real surprise. And we're not hypothesizing that this is a case of death in childbirth or anything like that. It's about a 20-week fetus. So somewhere in the middle of the second trimester, not viable. not a stillbirth or anything like that. The bone on the left, this is the first rib, so right up under your collarbone. The bone on the left is a plastic cast from a 40-week, so full-term infant. The one on the right is the same first rib from the 20-week fetus. This scale is marked in centimeters. So between for example, the 1 and the 2, that's about the width of your thumbnail, maybe even a little bit smaller. So it's a very, very tiny little piece of bone, and one of my eagle-eye students spotted it. And we have we recovered about 40%, maybe a little bit more of that skeleton. So what did we find out? Well, it turned out that despite having a relatively low life expectancy, at least as far as what we found, they were in generally good health. They didn't have any nutritional inadequacies. They didn't have any growth disruptions in childhood because of malnutrition or anything like that. No contagious disease, no interpersonal violence, no evidence of any beatings or anything like that. What we did find, though, is that they were hard workers, not surprisingly, that they have arthritis patterns, that they have muscle attachment patterns that suggest a lifetime, among the adults, a lifetime of strenuous physical labor, which again is what we would expect. When we talk about some of the other pathological elements, we'll talk about, for example, trauma, skeletal trauma. This is just an example. These are the 10th through 12th thoracic vertebra. So those are the ones just above your lower back. And there's supposed to be 3 of them. And they are, in fact, all compressed into a single block. This is a pretty significant compression fracture of these vertebrae that has then healed altogether, that the bone has sort of buttressed itself. There's some wedging of the vertebra. This would have been the result of a fall, somebody falling out of a tree or falling off the back of a wagon and landing on their backside and suffering that compression of those vertebrae. The other trauma that we see in this group of folks is consistent with that none of it suggests any sort of violence, that these are the typical sorts of accidental traumas that you would expect from a hardworking segment of society. We see some suggestion of infection, that, for example, this is your left pinky toe, the metatarsal that's sort of up in the body of your foot, circled right there, and this round hole is the evidence that's left behind by a little infectious lesion. This one happens to be very nicely healed. This is not what killed this person, but they probably had a pretty nasty infection on their foot for quite some time. This is the kind of thing that you'd get from a mosquito bite that gets infected, a blister from ill-fitting shoes that gets infected, a injury from not having shoes, perhaps, something like that. Again, typical of what we might expect. This is another case of infection. This is what's called osteomyelitis, which is when you get an infection of the marrow cavity of the long bones. And this is a much more serious infection going on. The interesting thing about it is that it's on both legs, both left and right legs, from just above the knee all the way down into the ankle. And you can see, so here's the bottom end of the femur, and you can see that it's sort of expanded and that the surface of the bone is sort of pebbly, grainy looking, that this is clearly some infection going on here. And then this tibia, This is, again, a model of sort of what the contours of this bone ought to look like. And then this is what this one looks like. There's a lot of decomposition that has also gone on, but you can see that the entire shaft of that bone is sort of grossly swollen and very much different from what a healthy bone would look like. So we've got a serious bone infection going on here. Because we've got it on both sides of the body, it suggests to me that this is not the result of some sort of injury, but that this is actually a blood-borne infection that's going on that has settled in the joints. And I'm looking into the idea that this might actually represent tuberculosis. That one of the things that we know, one of the less common expressions of tuberculosis is that it'll settle into a joint. And that it being on both sides would be typical of that. The thing about it is that I didn't see any of the lung, the evidence that you might get from the lung infection that you get with tuberculosis. Being the mid-19th century, though, tuberculosis would have been, I would have been surprised if we hadn't seen it in this population. So, but I don't know for sure that that's what's going on with this particular individual.
Dr. Shannon, does, with the image there, the tibia, does the disease accelerate decomposition, or is there a way to tell if?
It does, yes. That the pathological bone is less dense because it's trying to sort of repair itself and rebuild itself. So it's less dense than healthy bone. So yes, indeed, that's exactly what's going on, is that the decomp is progressed farther because the bone tissue is less dense. Yeah. One of the other things we saw was dental disease. I don't know how many folks have had a cavity. This individual certainly, this is burial 18 again, this is the young woman, and she had a couple of doozies of cavities that you see, this one here, and then this one that has really essentially destroyed that wisdom tooth there. When I looked at the cavities that this population had overall, what I saw is that there were actually not that many cavities, but that they were all really big. But for the most part, were really big. And what that says to me is that these folks were eating a very high carbohydrate diet. And that carbohydrates are what feed the microorganisms that cause dental cavities, and that they were progressing very, very quickly. So once you get a cavity, you get it and it runs, and it becomes a very large cavity very quickly. And then once you get a large cavity that, for example, both of these would have, that these are dead teeth here, and it quickly progresses to what we call ante-mortem tooth loss, right? Losing your tooth before you die. And of course, that's what those two gaps are there. And that's the reason we don't see so many small cavities, because most of them progressed quickly and then moved on quickly to being lost teeth. And so we have no record of those cavities. The intermediate step in between big cavity and lost tooth is a dental abscess. And that's what you have going on with this individual here, that this molar here with the root exposed has a big cavity in the surface of it, which allowed the tooth to become infected, and then you get this dental abscess. And so you get the exposure of the tooth root, and then you get the drainage, etc. A lovely thing to have in one's mouth. And then that's where you get the tooth loss proceeding from there. Other than that, dental health was pretty good. Now, when we talk about having a high carbohydrate diet in Middle Tennessee in the 19th century, we're talking about corn, right? That these folks are eating a typical upland South diet of corn and probably pork, cornbread morning, noon, and night. That would have accelerated dental decay. this would not have been limited to the enslaved communities either, that everybody at that time period was eating cornbread morning, noon, and night. So that they may have actually been better off because they wouldn't have had that much access to actual sugar. So I want to give you a quick case study. This that I'm going to talk about is burial 13. And burial 13 was interesting both from a pathology perspective, but also from the perspective of thinking of this as an African American community that's being represented here. Burial 13 was about a 17 to 21-year-old boy, young man. He was a big kid. He was tall, 5'10", 5'11", really robust skeleton, very rugged young man. The thing that's interesting about him is that I think that he may have had sickle cell disease. There's a handful of details about his skeleton that lead me to believe that. First of all, he's got this condition that's called a slipped capital femoral epiphysis, which means that the ball of the femur, when it's growing, right, there's that little growth cap there. And in this case, it was disrupted before it could fuse to the neck of the femur in adulthood, and it literally slipped. And so you can see here, if I use my little, right, that this is the edge of that cap, right? And this is the edge of where that cap is supposed to be, right? And so it has slipped off one side. That's a condition that is occasionally associated with sickle cell disease. More frequently, you actually get the bone death. You get avascular necrosis of the head of that femur is actually the more typical condition that you see with sickle cell disease. These are the left and right femora next to one another. This is the healthy one, and this is the one that's got the slipped capital epiphysis. You can see that the neck appears to be shorter, and that the head of it is slipped somewhat. He also had gout in his big toe of his left foot. Yeah, first of all, very painful. Yeah. Unexpected in a 17 to 21-year-old. And that really threw me. And it's interesting because gout results from an overload of uric acid in your bloodstream, and the uric acid precipitates out of your blood and turns into these uric acid crystals that get into the joint, and they're very painful. Anybody that's ever had gout will tell you that they're very painful. A lot of inflammation, a lot of swelling. You're not able to walk. They say that you can't even stand to have a sheet over your foot when you've got this going on. This particular joint is the most common location in the human body for gout to show up, the first joint of your big toe. And those uric acid crystals produce these little cavities in the end of that joint. And this is absolutely textbook gout as far as this is concerned. So this was actually what started me thinking about it. What is a 17-year-old doing with gout? Sickle cell disease, right? That it puts an extra strain on your kidneys because, of course, you get the with sickle cell disease, you get the rupturing of the sickled red blood cells, and then your kidneys have to work overtime clearing that out of your blood. And so kidney disease is a common side effect of sickle cell disease, and gout is associated with kidney disease, that your kidneys aren't cleaning that uric acid out of your blood, and so that's so juvenile gout is highly correlated with sickle cell disease. The other thing that we see is possibly an intracranial aneurysm. Now, this is the inside of the skull that you're looking at. So we're looking at this part, looking at it this way. and you have a suture that goes across the top of your head right here, and this hole is not supposed to be there, but it's not damage, right? That hole was there during life. And I think that what it is, there's some large blood vessels that run along either side of that suture. And I think this represents an aneurysm in one of those blood vessels that is building and building and is putting pressure on the inside of the skull vault. And so it's leaving an impression of that aneurysm. We know that in untreated sickle cell disease, that it's a common cause of death to have either an aneurysm or a stroke, even for very young people. And so again, this is associated with that. The interesting thing about sickle cell disease is, of course, it's a genetic condition, and it's actually a single genetic marker. And so we can look at it through DNA. We did DNA on this group of folks to see if we could figure out their ancestry, and I've been looking for some additional funding to do the DNA work to see if he does in fact have the sickle cell trait. That I've got a couple, I have a grant in with the Tennessee Historic Commission, and then also on campus at MTSU there's a grant. So I'm hoping later this year that we'll know whether or not that's what this young man had going on. So the question that they actually asked me to answer after I did all of this other work, the question I was actually asked to answer is this a population of enslaved African Americans, or is this a cemetery with non-African folks buried in it? And what we find out is that looking at some of the skeletal traits, that they do in fact seem to have been, for the most part, of African descent. When we talk about using skeletal remains to try and figure out ancestry, we're not so much walking a fine line, because it's well accepted in the discipline that there are certainly differences between different groups of human beings, and it's all genetic in origin. That if my ancestors came from one spot on the earth and they tended to marry and reproduce more with the other folks from their spot on the earth, and your ancestors came from another spot on the earth and they tended to marry and reproduce with the folks that were closest to them, then there are these little skeletal traits that don't have any significance in terms of functionality or individual worth or anything like that. They're just skeletal differences that are inherited in these different gene pools, right? So we don't want to think of this in any way as any sort of profiling or anything like that, that we're looking at skeletal traits that indicate people being members of the same gene pool. And in this case, this group of folks were, to me, pretty clearly members of an African gene pool. And there's some little traits. For example, there's this thing that's called a post-bregmatic depression, which means this point right here on your skull is bregma, and this little sort of swoop right there, instead of being a little bit more of an arched contour, there's a little bit of a depressed contour right there. That's a very typical trait for folks of African ancestry. There are these things that are called frontal grooves. They're little, they're marks from blood vessels that are on your skull. If you ever see in the cartoons where somebody's mad and their head is throbbing, right at their temples, it's those little blood vessels that you're seeing. Some folks, they're on the inside of your head, some folks, they're on the outside of your head. In populations of African descent, they're more frequently on the outside of your head. And so you get these little vessel tracks like you see here and like you see here. something called a central diastema. Diastema is a fancy word for a gap between your teeth, right? And the central diastema is probably the most common that we see in people, and it is also typical of African populations to have, in fact, a very wide central diastema. When I'm talking to the students, I always say, you know, like Michael Strahan, the football announcer, right? He's got that great gap. Well, the folks from Grassmere actually had this trait very frequently, and it makes me wonder how many of them were actually related to one another. So we had the skeletal traits that tell us that these folks were probably of African descent. And then we went ahead and did some DNA testing, and we took our samples. The best sample for testing for DNA of any kind is an unworn molar tooth, because your molars have the thickest enamel, right? And so it's sort of like a little jewel box or something like that that holds that DNA material inside and does the best job of keeping it from being contaminated by DNA from earthworms and soil microbes and archaeologists, right? Which is why I'm wearing gloves, taking these samples, because you don't want to, of course, mistake someone else's DNA for the DNA of the folks that you're looking at. So we took samples from 3 different individuals. Remember I said that the cemetery was in these 2 long lines. So we took 1 person from each end and 1 from the middle. Since we're talking about more than likely family groups, we thought we'd spread them out as much as possible to avoid having 2 people from the same family, because of course their DNA is going to come out the same. So we tried to spread them out as much as possible. We had enough funding to do 3 samples. Historic Nashville Incorporated and the Metro Historic Commission, I need to thank them, in addition to the Nashville Zoo, because they are the ones that provided that funding for these DNA samples. Sent them off to the lab. And what we got were perfectly equivocal results. Not unequivocal, equivocal results. This is burial number 18, our young mother. When I looked at her skeletal remains, she's, to me, clearly of African descent. That all of these traits that I have listed here are consistent with African ancestry. The DNA sample that we sent was inconclusive, that there wasn't enough DNA left to figure out what her ancestry was. So much for that one. Burial number 3, another woman we sent her DNA off, and the results were returned that she was a member of haplogroup H, which is simply a designation for a gene pool, right? Haplogroup H. Haplogroup H is common to Europeans, Southwest Asians, in other words, the Middle East, and North Africans, so Egyptians, Moroccans, etc. This one was a little unusual. There were some few slaves that were imported to the New World who were from Muslim nations of North Africa, but the vast, vast majority of the slaves who were brought to the New World were from sub-Saharan West Africa. So this is an anomalous genetic profile here, and unfortunately the preservation was so poor that I wasn't able to assess the skeletal ancestry of this individual. One of the things that's different about her, though, is that she's the only person in the entire cemetery who had coffin hardware. Other than, you know, the nails used to put them together, she actually had handles, and there's these 2 brass handles, and then there was also a hinge, which suggests maybe a viewing plate in the front of the coffin, which was pretty common in the 19th century. It didn't have any glass in it, which would have been typical, so it wasn't that much of an investment. So maybe she's different somehow, if she was the only one who got this sort of slightly fancier coffin. Question being, we don't know in what way she was different. But she doesn't match genetically the rest of the group. And then thank goodness for burial 10. I was a little worried when I saw the results from the first two. And then burial 10, thank goodness. Again, skeletally speaking, she's clearly of African descent. Then we have this, again, whole list of traits that suggest that her ancestry is African. And she is a member of haplogroup L, which is not just characteristic of folks of African descent, but in fact is as African as you can get. That haplogroup L is the oldest lineage, not only the oldest lineage of Africans, but in fact the oldest lineage of humans. That the woman that's referred to as mitochondrial Eve, the earliest modern human that we know of from Africa 200,000 years ago, is a member of haplogroup L. So thank goodness for burial 10, that we have a clear African signature there. It is a cliche for archaeologists to say that more research is necessary, but in this case, again, this funding that I've been looking for, I also requested funds to do the DNA of ancestry for the rest of the adults in this group. And so maybe we'll straighten some of this out a little bit more and find out a little bit better about this community, because it's been very interesting. So the story ends back where it started. On June the 14th, 2014, the remains were reburied at a location next to the Croft house, so up on the hill with everybody else. They're in a position sort of analogous to the family cemetery. They were reburied in their original positions so that if they were indeed in family groups, as we assume they were, that the families are back together. This is where they're going to stay. The reburial took place in June, and then there was a dedication of the cemetery. They put a simple fieldstone wall around it, and they are marked with fieldstones that were actually collected from the site of the cemetery where it was originally excavated. We don't know that any of these fieldstones were the original headstones of any of these folks, but at least they came from that same plot of land. The thing that pleases me so much about this project, and we've been fortunate enough to have a good bit of publicity about it, the thing that pleases me the most about it is that it has caught people's attention so much in Nashville, and that Nashville as a whole is really experiencing a kind of a renaissance in terms of historic preservation and people recognizing the importance of the history of our city, and that this is an opportunity to educate our kids and to really get people to understand that Nashville, you know, we love Music Row and we love hot chicken and we love Lower Broad, but that our city was built, a lot of it was built with slave labor. You know, a lot of it rests on the back of white tenant farmers and brave frontiersmen and you know, the folks that sat in at the lunch counters, and that this is part of the history, and that I'm glad to be part of bringing it to a little bit more respect. So, and if you can't read this, the plaque that's there says, "Here lie 20 unknown individuals who lived and worked on this property, reinterred with reverence at this site, 12th day of June 2014. And each of the graves had a yellow rose. The mother and infant had 2 yellow roses. So it was really a lovely memorial, and I was glad to be able to see that as well. So, and I'm grateful to everybody who made this possible, and thank you for having me out today. And
just a couple of questions. So there are varying levels of preservation amongst the
Yes.
bones. So
Yes.
is that typical, or is that something about the land there at Grassmere? Or?
It is typical. The variance in preservation in this particular case, well, typically you get variance in preservation between children and adults, first of all. Children's bones are smaller, they're less dense, they're not as thick, and so children's bones tend to, decompose before adult bones do. As we said, pathological bones go quicker than healthy bones. In this particular case, there seems to have been a temporal progression from one end of the line to the other end of the line, and that the earlier burials on one end of the line were not as well preserved as the later burials on the other end of the line. I think there may have been a little difference in elevation as well between those, and that's typical of cemeteries as well, that you get differences because of the terrain. So, yes?
First of all, were you so excited when they called you?
I was jumping out of my skin.
Second of all, were your students excited when they got to do this, and have any of the students carried this further to where you think they're going to get into this field?
Well, you know what? I'm going to brag a little bit on MTSU now, that we've got a great archaeology program at MTSU, great anthropology program. And we are an undergraduate only major, that we don't have any graduate students. And so one of the things that enables us to do is to pour all of our attention and all of our energy into our undergrads. And so we treat them like grad students. And so they do a lot of research, not just with me, but with the other archaeologists and the anthropology faculty with us. And we've constantly got them working on projects. I teach a course in human osteology, and then once the students have learned, the basics of the human skeleton and identifying the fragmentary pieces and stuff, then they're ready to come into the lab with me. And so when I got the call about this, I knew it was going on, and I was kind of hoping, and I had sort of put some, ideas in the wind that I might be interested in looking at this if someone were to ask. So I got the call, and I was very excited, and the students were absolutely thrilled. They're incredibly dedicated group of kids, smart as whips, and I think a good number of them, based on this project and some others that we've worked on, will definitely go into this field. And I couldn't be more thrilled. So it's very exciting to be part of it. So.
Thanks, fascinating presentation.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
There's some evidence, documentary evidence of the Westington plantation in Robertson County, that their slaves, some coffins were purchased for their enslaved, and buried there. So has anyone come up with a paradigm yet that maybe it has to do with the wealth of the plantations? Or I'm just thinking these are two cemeteries we've seen coffin hardware in.
Yeah.
So is that just completely not common, or where have you seen the more of the shroud burial?
Well, it's interesting because shroud burials, as I said, are the more typical. And the other case that I've been involved in personally was the cemetery from Ingleside Plantation, which was a sister plantation to the Hermitage, that it was owned by, I gotta get my Donaldsons right here, William Jefferson Donaldson, who was the uncle of Rachel Donaldson Jackson. And it was adjacent to the Hermitage. And in fact, the Ingleside and Hermitage slaves often worked together in work gangs and that kind of stuff. It almost was a single community. So in that case, but their slaves were buried in shrouds and without evidence. There may have been some clothing. I'll have to go back and look at that. I do believe some of them did have buttons that would indicate clothing, but no coffins. That's my personal experience.
Sure.
So yeah, you can't imagine anybody more wealthy than Andrew Jackson and the Donaldsons. So, although by that point in time they were apparently spending a lot of money supporting the younger generation.
Yeah, I don't know how wealthy Jackson was.
Exactly.
1840s anyway.
Right, exactly. So maybe that was where they were economizing, but yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.